Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verse 8. The preacher. Charlie Rapp. So we're in a section here that begins in verse 8 and goes through chapter 6, verse 12. I don't think we'll get through chapter 6, verse 12 tonight. So maybe we'll just read chapter 5, verse 8 through the end of the chapter, verse 20. Would anybody like to volunteer to read those verses for us?
Where was it again?
Chapter 5, 8 through 20. That's comforting, huh?
Man's charge of man. When is that ever wrong? Moreover, the profit of the land is for all. Even the king is served from the field. He who loves silver will not be satisfied with silver, nor he who loves abundance with increase. This also is vanity. When goods increase, they increase who eat them. So what profit have the owners, except to see them with their eyes? The sleep of a laboring man is sweet, whether he eats little or much, but the abundance of the rich will not permit him to sleep. There is a severe evil which I have seen under the sun, riches kept for their owner to his hurt. But those riches perish through misfortune. When he begets a son, there is nothing in his hand. As he came from his mother's womb naked, shall he return. Go as he came. To go as he came. He shall take nothing from his labor, which he may carry away in his hand. This is also a severe evil. Just exactly as he came, so shall he go. And what profit has he who has labored for the wind? For his days he also eats in darkness, and he has much sorrow and sickness and anger. Here is what I have seen. It is good and fitting for one to eat and drink and to enjoy the good of all his labor, in which he toils under the sun in the days of his life, which God gave him, for it is his heritage. As for every man to whom God hath given riches and wealth, and given him power to eat of it, to receive his heritage and rejoice in his labor, this is the gift of God. For he will not dwell unduly on the days of his life, because God keeps him busy with the joy of his heart.
Thank you, Chris. All right. I'll open us with prayer. Father, we ask that you would give to us the joy of the Lord, the joy of our salvation, the joy of fellowship with you and with one another as we open your word together and we discuss it. Lord, we pray that you would make our conversation fruitful. We ask that you would be glorified in the meditations of our hearts as we are pondering your word. We pray, Lord, that you would sanctify us by your word, that you would show us the good that you have stored up for us in all of the promises that are ours in Jesus' name. And it's in his name that we ask it. Amen. Well, take notice, you guys, that we, in the first 5 verses of chapter 5, or first 7 verses of chapter 5, that there was a conclusion to the previous section that had, and we know it's the conclusion because this is the pattern in the book of Ecclesiastes, is that he sets out in each section to tell us things that he has seen, and it's trouble, right? He sees trouble as he looks at the world and the condition of the world under the sun, under the vanity of life lived under God's judgment. In a world that is under God's judgment, a world that is cursed under the curse of sin. That as we got to remember when we're thinking about what is being described throughout the book of Ecclesiastes, it is parallel to what Paul says in Romans chapter 8 when he talks about the creation has been subjected to futility by God, and he subjected it to futility in hope, Paul says. So the creation groans under that futility. All of creation groans under that futility, but it is for the purpose of finding hope. And Solomon groans with us, or the preacher, as he identifies himself, he groans with us as he looks at life under the sun, and he sees what we see, and he groans with us about it. But then he always, at the end of each section, takes us to a point of hope. And chapter 5, verses 1 through 7, was that last section's conclusion that brings us to the point of hope, which we saw was the preacher saw all kinds of trouble in chapters 4 and 5 with, or chapter, was it 3? Was it the end of chapter? No, just we looked at chapter 4. There at chapter 4, he sees the futility and sin's effect on relationships and community, and then he brings us to a point of hope by giving us instruction at the beginning of chapter 5 about the community and the fellowship that we have with God, and making sure that we don't mess that up too, that we don't let sin break in upon that relationship, so that we can maintain the hope of eternal life by drawing near to God and actually meeting with Him, not meeting with our dreams and imaginations. And he talks about those kinds of things there in those verses. I like what one pastor says about chapter 5, verse 8 and following. It's, if you follow the way that the preacher outlines this section, it's as if he takes us to God's house. He takes us into the house of God, into the worship of God, and gives us and helps safeguard our knowledge of God. And then it's as if with chapter 5, verse 8, we come out of the house of God and boom, we're right back into the world of life under the sun. And we're right back into descriptions of things that are unsettling. And one pastor I was reading on this, he says this. He says, the preacher takes us from the house of God and back out into the world again, which shows us that the world under the sun didn't transform itself into heaven between the time we entered and exited our meeting with God in the house of God. The house of God is no rabbit's foot or genie bottle that when rubbed makes the bad things go away. And one of the things that I think that's a good thought that is helpful, because if we're right in what I've been saying about the book being about observing the world as it is under the futility of the curse of sin, in order to lead us to where we can find true hope in this world, then we have to, one of those places, and the primary place we find that is in fellowship with God, in relationship with Him, drawing near to Him in His house. But then we come back out again, and the volume of time that the preacher spends in this book talking about life lived in the futility and vanity of sin's curse is appropriate, because if you think about, that's most of life, isn't it? And that's kind of like 6 days during the week we're laboring, we're toiling, we're we're striving, we're living with all the broken things that the preacher talks about. But then God gives us, He does give us a break from that by calling us into to stop, to cease, to come into His worship, to hear the gospel, to meet with Him, and only for us to go back out into the world again, right? And so, part of our regular routine then as Christians is coming into worship, hearing about hope, and going back out into the world where there is futility and brokenness. And we are perhaps wondering at times, if we can see, maybe we experience God, we see God, and we know God, and we take pleasure in God in worship, but then we, in the midst of our experience of laboring and toiling, which is so much of what Solomon talks about throughout the book, we are wondering where we see God in the midst of that. Where can we in our labor and our work also enjoy God, and how can we see God in our everyday, ordinary life? And what we're going to see here in chapters 5 and 6 is that Solomon again returns to observing life, things about labor, and specifically our work, and ordinary things that we see and experience all the time. And in the midst of what he observes, he brings us again to a place of hope, and seeing hope and finding hope in the midst of the futility of our work. So let's take a look at this. We're just going to go verses 8 and 9, first of all. Is it hot in here to you guys? You're not hot? Are you hot? Is it okay if I open that? Okay. Anybody? Huh? Yeah, I ate a bunch of hot crushed red pepper, so maybe my... All right. Okay, so notice in verse 8, this is one of the more common verbs in the book of Ecclesiastes. It's the verb to see. And we've seen, this is his pattern. He invites us to see with him the condition of the world. So what does the preacher see in verses 8 and 9? What is it that he sees? Let's describe it. With your help, let's describe it.
Violent perversion of judgment.
Yeah, a violent perversion of judgment, of righteousness. Corrupt officials. Okay, so he's looking out on the...
That's a novelty.
Yeah, right.
Doesn't happen in our country. I've never heard of such a thing.
He just...
Broken system.
A broken system. Yeah, a bureaucracy. He's talking about different levels of management and of organization and leadership, and how the whole thing is fouled up. How the whole thing is fouled up.
My translation is a lot different than Chris.
Okay, you have ESV?
In verse 9 is where it particularly
Yes.
is different. It says, "But this is gain for land in every way, a king committed to cultivated fields."
Yeah, thank you for bringing that. That was my next little tidbit of information here. The Hebrew of verse 9 is a little tricky. And there's no question about what kinds of nouns and verbs we're dealing with, but the verbs in particular are, the verbal form of them could be read as some Hebrew verb forms in active and passive tenses, they look identical. So the context has to tell us, is it active or passive? And it does raise a question about how best to translate verse 9. Most most translations today, and older translations too, I'm not saying this is a just the way King James translates it, it it puts the emphasis on the land rather than on the leadership, which there's another way to translate it that keeps the emphasis on the leadership and takes it off of the land. But the way the New King James says it is, moreover, the profit of the land is for all. Even the king is served from the field. So it shifts the emphasis from verse 8, which is on leadership, to all of a sudden in verse 9, it's emphasizing the field and the produce that is created. The ESV and many newer translations keep the emphasis of the translation on the leadership, and this is how the ESV says it. But this is gain for a land in every way, a king committed to cultivated fields. So the emphasis is on how the king in this case is interested in cultivating the fields, which is beneficial to everybody. This is gain for a land in every way, a king committed to cultivated fields. Now, what is he getting at there? Well, in verse 8, he sees something negative, only negative, right? It is oppression of the poor, the violent perversion of justice and righteousness in a province. For high official watches over high official, and higher officials are over them. Well, who's over the highest officials? The king. In this cultural setting, right? It's going to be a king. This is back in the day where the democracies and republics had not been born. That concept is foreign. You're going to have kings, and then his hierarchy under him of officials executing his will. So verse 8 is focused on what is negative about this situation of injustice and violence. But in verse 9, he puts a spin on it where he says, but yet there is something even in this system of government where there is good, there is gain, there's profit for everyone. And what is it found in? Well, the fact that the king is motivated to cultivate the fields. Like, there's no profit for the king to let the fields go barren. Why? Because he taxes that field. That's where he gets his wealth. The wealth of his kingdom is going to come from that field. So he's going to make sure the fields are planted. He's going to make sure the harvest comes in as far as he has the power to do it. But even though and here's the thing, even if he's greedy and he's doing it for the greed of his own gain, just like all of the hirelings underneath him, even if he's selfishly motivated, there's still benefit for the people in his land. Why? Because food to eat. At least they have food to eat, So it's interesting that Solomon puts a little bit of a positive spin on the situation here. Maybe this is an ancient form of trickle-down in economics, Reagonian economics, that you keep the wealth, you don't overtax the wealthy, and they will invest, and it'll all trickle down to everybody. I don't know, but yeah.
It strikes me as, this is obviously complete and translated by people way smarter than me, but to me, when I look at this, I'm going to be reading it and talk and just kind of trying to make sense of this. You see the oppression of the poor and the violent perversion of justice, and not just in a province. But on more left matter. The high official watches over a high official, and high officials are over them. It's almost like, look, that's not even your stuff. You're going to get all concerned about something you can't change, because that is what that is. That is going to be what that is, and that's just that. And to me, that provides a greater context.
Yeah.
It almost could be at the end of verse 8, you could say, and this also to be concerned.
Right.
Like, you see the oppression, you go, you have to wonder, why in the world? And you go, oh, that's right, you've got these other people that are making their moves, and then the people above them are making their moves. and they're all trying to stay in the king's good graces to keep their head, at the same time
Yeah.
trying to also profit. Not much has changed.
Right.
Moreover, the profit of the land is for all. Even the king is served. See, I figured served from the field, they would serve him from the field, but served, he's served by that. It serves him
Yeah.
to allow that and to promote that and to let that be.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that can be overlaid on verse 9, if it's whatever's going on in that kingdom, the king allows.
Yeah.
He knows these guys are rats. But at some point, you know, that old saying, right? Unless you're stealing a little, you're probably stealing a lot. And so when I look at this with with that specific terminology, I'm thinking, okay, that is what that is, and it still serves the king.
Yeah.
He still, because like I said, he gets taxed, he gets the taxes, he gets this. The people are at least satiated appetite-wise. They're busy, so they don't
Yeah.
foment revolution. They're not marching on his capital with
Right, yeah.
pitchforks saying, hey, this is not working.
Yeah.
They might be encouraged to do that. It's interesting that when I read that, so you got high officials, basically you got the mice watching the cheese. So what can you do about that as a farmer? You're just gonna go hoe. In
Well,
your row.
There's the question for us. Yeah. What
What
does the
can you
preacher?
do?
What does the preacher want? And here's what we're kind of building to. What does the
Doesn't mean
preacher
steal
want
that,
us?
right.
No. That's perfect. What does the preacher want us to do? Because you can read verse 8 and you'd be like, oh, we're getting all worked up inside, and we're gonna grab our pitchforks. We're going to town. We're taking back this. We're taking the granary. If we take the granary, then we've got all.
Make Israel
Make Israel great again. The system of oppression that he sees. He describes this situation because he wants to give us counsel. He wants to help us. And
What's the date here, Jeff? Has this been dated within?
back in the beginning of the book, we talked about how the book's identifiers of the author have historically been understood to be that of Solomon, the son of David, the king in Jerusalem, the wisest of the wise. So Solomon's reign is going to follow David's in the 10th century. So 970 BC. 970 BC. There you go. Yeah. So David's time of flourishing his kingdom was 1000.
So 3,000 years, we can look back at history and say,
This is it.
yes. It's everywhere. It's endemic
Yeah.
in everything you see moving forward. I mean, even with the advent of our republic and how we tried to make things different, the second we boot those guys, they're telling George Washington, hey, we want you to be king. He's like, are you high?
Yeah.
Are you high? What are you even talking about?
Yeah.
So there's this, it's almost like there's this, the king, everybody else, and then everybody else. There's his minions, and that seems to be a structure that God has allowed to, well, it provides perspective to this because we can see it throughout history that this is actually a candid observation from the standpoint that this is not just in that kingdom, this is in kingdoms.
Yeah.
It says here, well, if you don't mind, it says,
Yeah.
the book becomes an essay of comparisons between the life of a person without law, without God, and one with a God-centered focus. So, there's the phrase, vanities of vanities, all is vanity, and to everything there is a season, are probably the most recognized scripture from this book.
From the book. Yeah.
I just thought that was, when you look at that, because I've often wondered, because every once in a while I'm sitting in my chair and I'm watching the news, I'm just like, you know what? Because it wells up within you. You want to see
Right.
equity and justice in its
Absolutely.
form as you can.
Is there a reset button?
Right.
Right.
Well, they're trying to do that right now, the wrong way though. So the idea is, I guess that, there's this ideal that we want and we know in our heart because we're filled with the Lord that we want those. We want justice. We want it to be pure. We want it to be godly after fashion because our law is fashioned after, essentially, God's law. It's just, hey, you can't do
Right.
that. Why? Because you can't take another guy's stuff. You can't
Right.
do that. You can't kill your neighbor. I mean, all those different things. And so when I look at this, it reinforces that belief I have that man was never meant to rule man. God is meant to rule man.
Right.
It's generally a theocracy. But again, there's people involved and they're fallen. So then you have that part of it. Where
Yeah.
you got, hey, let's all drink the Kool-Aid. Whoa.
Right.
Hang on. So it's just, this is, and I've never really looked at it that way and kind of got it out and Tony Starked it like that, but it's interesting that this is endemic in man. This verse right here, these two verses, it's endemic.
Yeah.
This is how it goes.
And to further prove that point, what is the one command that he gives us in these two verses?
Not
We-
to marvel or be amazed.
Yes. Do not be amazed. Don't marvel at this. This is ordinary. This is unspectacular,
Yeah,
right?
right.
You know, that's the idea.
Yeah, this is not
You
unusual.
see it when the children of Israel cry out for a king, and Samuel tells them, "This is what the king's going to do.
Yeah, he's gonna
He's
take
going
your
to take your
stuff."
men, your children, your
Right.
boys, and he's going to train them as soldiers. He's going to take
A king like the
you know,
nations.
Yeah, all these things, and even God in Deuteronomy, when he's talking to Moses, lays things down that they're not to multiply wives, they're not to multiply
Right.
horses.
And silver and
Solomon multiplies wives. He builds cities where he has his chariots and
That's
his
right.
horses, and he does everything that, so.
And here's the other thing we know, because scripture it just, and he's still the wisest of our time. That guy is still the troubles, man after God's own heart.
Yeah, David
And
had
just,
a lot of.
hey, you're right. It's
He
just
correct his sons with
Yeah.
the one son that
and
raised his
Tamar and bringing
his-
that whole
his
thing
own
with this Absalom.
half sister. Yeah, it's like.
Yeah, sure.
Solomon grew up with that.
Yeah,
And we see, I mean, this is the story of the kingdoms of the earth. You know, this is their story. And it is pretty, I just thinking about my own reaction to it, you know, as you mentioned, sitting in your chair watching the nightly news, and somehow, you know, we're still caught by surprise. You know, like, just,
It's like,
what?
you know, yeah. So-and-so was caught in a scandal, and you just go, what's going on, honey? Just same as it ever was.
Last
Yeah,
long.
same as it ever was.
Exactly.
Same as it ever was. Water at the bottom of the ocean.
What kind of help is he?
I got it.
Of course you did. We were that generation.
There's an old saying too, so the further you go out in the ocean, the wetter it gets.
Yeah.
The wetter it gets.
Yeah, that's
Well, what is the help that Solomon gives us here? I mean, how does his instruction about what we see here, how does it help the believer? In what ways might it help the believer?
Kind of has you focused. He says, essentially, he says, work diligently and enjoy it and eat and drink because these are blessings of God,
Yeah,
even in the midst of all of that.
yeah,
And, you know, you're not going to take care of all of that,
yeah,
but you can enjoy the fruits of your labor that God gives to you.
right.
I never saw the context between 8, 9, and 10 until I separated out and I read them separately and then see what the dots are there. But that whole thing, you know, about the injustices and corruption, talk about the prophet and he's king of serve from them. He who loves serve will be satisfied. So this is another indication. This sort of gives part of this away. I think a little bit. It's a shadowing of like, so if you love silver, will be satisfied with silver, and he who loves abundance with increase. The more you have, the more you want. I told my boys this one time. I said, you're going to hopefully have a couple good runs in life, and you're going to get whatever. If you look up at that wealth that you have, it's going to go better for you. But if you look down on it, like, man, that's just not enough. There was a guy. You remember the story of Ron Ryrie?
No.
Got saved in prison. It's the story. Used to travel in the 70s doing this stuff. He was a bank robber and kidnapper, some silly thing. He had a ransom thing. And his story was like this. well, I don't remember it. So they got all this stuff, and they arrested him when they gave him the money he wanted, but anyway, he wanted $1 million, because that was a lot of money back in the seventies. It's like, 5, 6, 8, 10 million, whatever it is today in value. He says, I said, I opened up the briefcase, I looked at $1 million in US currency, hard currency, and the first thing he thought was, that is not enough. That is not, and that was the first thing he thought was, that is not enough. And $1 million back then, you're buying an island of the South Pacific and you're gone. But they just, they come in, then he goes to jail, and you got that story, and he finds Christ, and here we go. But I always wondered about that, and it reminded me of that from the standpoint that, the widow's mite story, when she gave all she had, and that was just trust the Lord. And some people go out there and increase, and they do whatever that is. But at the end of the day, it's, I don't think we should shun wealth. I think wealth is a healthy thing, because that's how things grow, and ministries grow.
Yeah, we're gonna.
It's the love of those things.
Right, and we really need to drill down on verses 10 through 17. When no, that's all right. I'm reeling you in. Come back. Okay, no, but these are all good thoughts, and yeah, just to conclude. Some observations from verses 8 and 9, just to say we've come up with some good insights on it. The takeaway from it is seeing the oppression and the violence. Solomon's first counsel is for us not to be amazed at it, to see how even in the midst of an oppressive system, God is still protecting people and accomplishing some good things, basic good things. There's still, even under kings and tyrants, there is still a way to look at that system and to find some grace and some provision in the midst of it.
Do you think that 9 is really, it's connected to 8 definitely, but do you think 8 and 9, it talks about the king committed to cultivated fields in this translation. Do you think that's really talking about the same situation that's in 8? Because you really think you're going to have at least maybe as many cultivated fields? We could at least pose it that way. If the poor are being oppressed and you're having a violation of justice and righteousness, or do you think it's saying sometimes the system works? Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's the best we've got at the moment. So to speak, does that make sense? What I'm saying?
That verse 9's relationship to 8 is.
Yeah, it may not be saying that if a king is committed to cultivated fields, that's necessarily the situation you're going to get. One of the scene of oppression and violation that he was talking about.
That might not occur.
Yeah, basically. It's not. You could read it as initially when I read it, it was like those go with each other, but not necessarily. If a king was really committed to cultivated fields, I think it probably makes sense that he would try and weed out those kind of things just for the sake of profit. If he's thinking clearly, which is obviously a rare thing, but
yeah, I suppose that that's a possibility that there is even a more optimistic spin, or not spin, but interpretation of.
I guess it could be optimistic. I'm not necessarily saying that that's. I guess that what I'm saying is that the king there's something for a king to do. There's a reason to have a king.
Mm-hmm.
Don't look at the current situation and just say, oh well, this whole system has to go. We got to make up a new thing or do it a new way.
Yeah.
Maybe there's some purpose that I don't know.
Well, no, certainly he's going to and has already reminded us of chapter 1. He himself is a king. He identifies himself as a king. So whether or not he lumps himself into and his kingdom with this system that he describes here, I think that he's keeping that identity in the backdrop for sure, because he identifies himself primarily as the preacher, so that his identity as the king. He does bring that in, but his identity as king connected to his identity as a king under God is going to certainly, when we get to the passages in here where he points us upward to look to God, that he's going to, I believe, have in mind another kingdom that transcends the kingdoms of this earth that are broken. But here's the thing, and I would argue that what verses 8 and 9 help us to do is to recognize that there is something unspectacular about the broken thing, as it's disappointing, but it's not uncommon. There's nothing it's normal. It's something that we're going to see when we open our eyes and look. And that serves the purpose of, part of his purpose here, leading down to verses 18 and 20.
And I think that is the main takeaway. I wasn't trying to distract from that.
No, that's good. I think he does give instruction about what the believer is to do when we see vain and futile, sin-cursed systems here on earth under the sun, and the instruction is pretty simple, right? Just don't be amazed by it. But I don't think that is necessarily a call to be passive either. Just kind of take it. That's just the way it's going to be. There's not. He doesn't call us to revolution. He doesn't call us to overthrow and turn the kingdoms of the earth into some kind of utopian paradise, or give us the hope. But yet at the same time, maybe not in this place, but other passages in Scripture, that doesn't leave us with another ditch to fall into, which would be to sit on our hands and do nothing. Don't engage the culture. Don't engage oppress. Don't do anything to yeah, there you go. Polish the brass on a ship. It's pointless good that can be accomplished from engaging the culture, and I don't think that's true either. In fact,
Well, if that's the case, then if everything is vanity, which is
might as
futile,
well just
then why get up tomorrow?
eating.
I mean, he brings us back to full circle and says, hey, the whole duty of man, right? It's that. It's fitting for us to do this.
right.
In the midst of all this stuff, go back to the way he
Yeah, and
like you look at
and sometimes, and some English translations translate the most common word in this book is the word in the New King James, that's vanity. Some translations render it meaninglessness. That's not a good translation of this word, because that's not the point. It is not meaningless. He's not saying that things are. He's saying they're crooked and they can't be made straight. They're crooked and they can't be made straight today, under this judgment on the nation. But the day is coming. Here's the idea: the day is coming when it will be made straight, and there is hope, and that's where the preacher keeps bringing us back. And there would be no point for him to bring us back to if there wasn't a future worth. So, in fact, when we get to verses 18 and 20, he uses language there that points us to the future. And so we don't want to rush ahead to that point yet, but we'll get there in a second, or a minute, or multiple minutes. But I was just thinking of when I was reading verses 8 and 9, Psalm 2 came to mind, and the church is at its best not when it's passive towards the world, but when it engages the world with the calling that God has given it, and that is prophetic in nature, right? It's not wrangling nations for power and control over the systems that exist, but pleading with them, as David does in Psalm 2, to kiss the Son. He says, "Be wise, O kings of the earth. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry, and you perish in the way." And you know what? That is to bring hope to the nations. It's to proclaim to them in their oppression and their violence that they're not going to get away with this. This is, and bound up in, and Solomon's already said it in this book, God has put eternity into the heart of man. God has put into our minds a sense of justice and judgment. And if people die, and we all die without seeing final judgment rendered and justice brought to pass, what does that tell us? Not that it doesn't exist, but that there's another world in which it does exist. And one day we're all going to that place. And it will be when Jesus Christ returns and he brings that justice and that judgment. So our calling isn't to be, oh, this is all meaningless. Oh, what can we do? No, I don't think the scriptures allow us to be pessimistic. I mean, there is a pessimism if we want to say we can't fix the nation state of China or Iran. We can't fix that. I mean, we could make it less. We could do things to make it less violent and less destructive, less painful. But we can't make it righteous. But we can call those people into the righteous nation that does exist on the earth, which is the church, which is God's holy people. And in other words, we can call them to kiss the Son and to be reconciled to God. So, that that really isn't Solomon's point here. I just think it's worth saying that. All right, if you guys are ready, we can move on to verses 10, 12. We've already touched on it a bit, but what's the connection between the preacher's observations in verses 8 and 9 and his next subject in verses 10 through 12, those three verses there? What kind of connection exists?
What's the dichotomy of the two archetypes?
Okay, explain what you mean by that.
So, as I sort of alluded to it earlier, those who love silver are satisfied with silver, he loves abundance with increase. This is also vanity. I would have put it at the end of 8. However, when goods increase, they increase who eat them.
Did you write it in?
I'm going to later. God, what are you thinking? I mean, come on.
We're going to rip that page out.
When goods increase, they increase who eat them. So it probably have the owners except to see them with their eyes. So that in itself, right there, I think can be associated for me, the high official and higher officials in these people. Yet the dichotomy that's listed here and the sort of the oppositional view is, however, the sleep of the laboring man is sweet, which would infer that their sleep is not. They're riddled with anguish, and they, the Bible talks about, the Lord gives his blessed. He gives us rest.
Yep.
So oddly enough, when we talk about the field, it refers to in verse 12, the sleep of a laboring man is sweet, whether he eats little or much, but the abundance of the which will not permit him to sleep. And so, in context, it's almost like it's more of a, I don't want to say it's, hey, who do you want to be here? Who do you want to be the guy that's always concerned about the backstab and the complete Machiavellian nature of what's being presented in that dynamic? And there's power, and there's prestige, and there's all the things that satisfy the flesh. It's on the other side, we see the opposite of that. The view of that is The sleep of the labor man is sweet. He rests. You know, he rests in his labor, knowing he's done a good job for that day. Whether he eats a little or a lot, it doesn't really matter. And the abundance of the rich will not permit him to sleep. So he's always wrestling with, man, I'm at risk here and this and that. Are they going to come? Am I getting back? There's just way too much to worry about. So these high officials, they got a lot of moving parts, especially in that kind of dynamic. I've never been in politics, but I can only see it from the outside, where you got to be. Okay, it reminds me, when I think about it, reminds me of that scene out of Jerry Maguire, when he brings his manifesto and here's how we're going to do it, and his two friends, one has it in his arm and they're all clapping for him, and that guy's like, and one guy leans over and says, how long do you give him? And the other guy says, 2 weeks, before they blow him out. They're like, yeah, you go, and then he's screwed. And so there's that in that dynamic of that higher end of business, and that culture of, dog eat dog, and the central idea is profit at any expense within a certain within a certain construct. But it's that again, it's Machiavellian. It's that me first. It's here's how we're going to do it. I'm going to screw my way to the top, and I'm going to use you to get what I want. And it's that silvery serpent smile. It's that what's his name? The guy in the first desert. What was his name? I can see his face. My mind is going. He said, "Your friends in Washington D.C." Donald Rumsfeld. Donald Rumsfeld. Thank you. Mine is going. Donald Rumsfeld said this at a press conference. He says, "Your friends in Washington are those that stab you in the chest."
Yeah,
and that's exactly what it is. Yeah, it's exactly. They're going to walk right up to you and stab you, and just be honest about it, versus trying to surreptitiously go behind you. And pretty soon it's like you've got a lance poking. What? Just look at me. What happened? So while the laborer doesn't have to worry about that.
Yeah.
He's concerned about the fields. He's minding whatever simple life he has.
he's just being oppressed.
Right, and it's interesting that when we talk about this, the high officials, because of the way that they're doing goods and increase, it reminds me of they're also involved in business and also involved in some other ancillary vocation, which they can profit from that position. Whereas this guy's, he's the single income guy. He is the single income guy, and whether it's a little bit or whatever, he's going to be good. However, these other guys, they don't sleep because they can't, because they're it's almost like not tormented.
Yeah.
They have a dark
So
soul.
Chris is identifying the oppressors of verses 8 and 9 as the rich, or those who are, am I right here?
Yeah.
Who are loving money,
That,
right?
Loving money. It's the filthy lucre crowd. It's the
Okay.
bring me the head of a pig.
You guys agree? Disagree? Have a different perspective?
I think it could be, and I think maybe it tends to be, but I don't think it necessarily always is. But I think it could be.
You might want to reread that again.
Yeah.
Okay, I will.
No, I think I agree with Chris's reading of that. Although Solomon doesn't make it explicit, if we were looking for a direct connection, I think that it isn't necessarily. It's not necessarily made here in these verses. However, in the Old Testament, and if you were here for our study of the book of James, where we got to chapter 5, and James is talking about the rich man, poor man contrast. The rich man, poor man contrast coming from the Old Testament, the book of Proverbs. The rich man isn't necessarily, in the poor are not necessarily those who have no money in their bank account. And the rich aren't necessarily those who are filled with, they're literally have overflowing bank accounts. It's a disposition of the heart towards riches. It's our disposition towards riches, which is what Solomon is talking about here. And we can certainly say this: the oppressors and the rich in the Old Testament are identified together. They get lumped into the same crowd. They are the rich, and this is the book of James too. Well, James's complaint. Do they not haul you into court? Chapter 2. It's the rich who have the means to pervert justice. And justice becomes a luxury that the poor can't afford. That's what happens in these systems, So and it's not foreign to us at all because,
What do you mean it becomes, how do you mean that?
Well, in the sense that if one of the integral parts to getting justice in an unjust system is you have to have money to do it. If you don't have money, you don't get the same justice. And that happens. Doesn't that happen? I mean, we can think of examples of that in our own system where there's a two-tiered justice system. There's one for the poor and there's one for the rich, and they're not the same. Lady Liberty is supposedly blind, but the system doesn't work in the favor of the poor, right? What? Okay. So, those two ideas, though, are commonly found together in the Old Testament. And if you want I can go back into my James notes. I didn't mine those out for here, but where you can, I've got a slew of verses where you can see those connections made between the rich and the powerful being identified together. So,
Two totally different worlds.
yep.
It's got to be that, because just think Abraham, rich, so Israel, the rich, they looted Egypt. That's
Yeah.
all they had. David, obviously, gathered up, saw him built the temple. Hey, nice gold, everything.
Yeah.
So, in that regard, riches in of what we do with that.
All right.
You do with it a shovel. I mean, a rock is
Yeah.
evil. Unless you kill Babel with it, then you're really
Yeah.
not on board. But so in and of itself, I think you're right. I don't think he's talking about the rich from the standpoint of, as you said, a dollar value or the commas and decimals you have. I think that's more of a frame of mind where it's that striving.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you strive? Why are you stranded in that? Why do you do this? Why do you pursue these things? And Christ is like, the rich young ruler. So we don't know. But a rich young ruler, was he rich, or did he read his heart and say, okay, tell you what, let's try this. Go sell all that you have and then come follow me. And he went away sorrowful because he couldn't do it. Because he was bound in that, I don't want to do that because then it's all about him. It's not about complete surrender to Christ of what he values most. And so, I mean, I'm sure
There's idolatry.
Well, yeah, it's an interesting.
I'm listening. No, go ahead.
Mark to jump in with a historical anecdote to support my thesis, but I'm being left out on the loan. I feel like I'm on that board on the ship. It's like, no, farther out. No, they're not going to fight. They're just,
We won't get wet. We're not that far out in the ocean.
That's right. We're not that far out. Right? you can probably, if you get on a body, probably kick and come right back up. It's really shallow. Right?
But there's
We're only
definitely
going to make 5.
Say that
there's a class,
a class, yeah.
a difference, yes,
There is.
definitely.
Yeah. It's been really ironic to listen to the impeachment talks and to hear some of those that are, really urging the impeachment of the president, saying the president's not above the law. Like no one is above the law, right? They're really concerned about abuse of power. But all these reports have been coming out that show that Hillary Clinton, not to be overly partisan here, but she she definitely got a kind of justice that you and I never would have gotten.
Yeah, when you were going on about that, I was thinking Burisma. Did I used to say Burisma?
Yeah, right?
She couldn't even
Everybody
her
should be
speech.
upset about that.
The Inspector General actually said that that was one of the errors
Oh,
that
yeah.
he agreed that occurred. So
I'm very
we're
upset
interested to
about
see
it.
if they
What
do
can I
anything
do about
about
What can we do? Yeah. Well, we can call our congressmen and we can write our senators and voice our opinion, but they're going to do what they're going to do, right?
When they put the whole FISA court thing together, they promised this would never happen.
Yeah, that's just a secret. So you put a star chamber together, and that's going to end well, because that's historically accurate. Said no one ever.
Yeah.
I mean, that goes
And
At least who knows what a star change is.
But that's part of what makes verses 10 through 12 really sweet, though, is because, the preacher is telling us in not so many words not to sympathize with the rich and the oppressors, right? Don't think that they're in a, positionally in terms of class and whatnot. Yeah, they are at ease, right? Think of Psalm 73, what the psalmist sees about the wicked and how they're sleek and fat, and they don't. It seems like everything goes right for them, but how could it be this way, God? It seems so unjust. And then he goes into the house of God and he's like, oh, that's right.
What we talked about.
That's
when
right.
The Bible talks about. It's almost like on the church side of that thing, the Pharisees, right?
Mhm.
Just empty sepulchers. You're hollow, dude. I mean, you got
Yeah.
the nice, cool stuff and kiss the ring and all that stuff, and you really, look at me and whatever, and then but empty.
Empty.
And Christ talks about when the two are standing on the street corner. Thanks for not making me like this poor sinner, and then. A guy says, hey, just be merciful to me, a sinner. That guy goes unjustified. The other guy doesn't get it still. He's all adorned. He's all in the things. And the trappings sometimes we get after success. And I've been to plenty of those seminars where the guy's just like, you can do it. You can get all this stuff. And you begin to get like, because it's enticing. It just is. And it just is. It's enticing. And the dynamic that I'm seeing here really plainly is the fact that it's not about really the have and the have not per se, like you mentioned. I think it really boils down to the condition of the heart.
Yeah.
This guy might have 40,000 acres. He's still going to sleep at night. Why? Because of his perspective. He's not out. He's paying his labors well. He's not. He's doing the right thing. He's all about that. He's in God's dynamic.
Yeah.
And these guys are they're in it for themselves, and that's just never going to work. Historically, it never works. I mean, history's replete with examples of that. So,
Yeah, before we pass on from verses 10 through 12, let's just identify three specific drawbacks to wealth that the preacher presents in these verses. I just summarized basically the content of each verse as the takeaway for the drawbacks to riches as he is talking about it here. What's the first one? What do you think? Verse 10.
Never satisfied.
Money never satisfies. Right? I mean, this is... we can see it pretty plainly in the life of somebody who's like a gambler, right? Their pursuit of riches leaves them with, they're penniless, and
Too much is not enough.
too much is, yeah, right. Too much is not enough. When is it enough? When has anybody ever said it's enough? If you're living in the pursuit of silver, when do you ever feel that you can finally say enough?
It's really sad, honestly, at the far ends of that. I don't know if you guys have seen the sign on I-5. It's some counseling organization that says gambling isn't fun anymore.
What
Oh,
was that again?
It's a rehabilitation center for people addicted to gambling. It says on it, when gambling isn't fun anymore. It's advertising for people who can't control their lust for the
Well,
money.
that's because they've set up all these Indian casinos around everywhere as the way to make money
yeah,
and live the high life, go
Right.
to concerts and eat good food and all of that, and it's living in that bubble world
right.
of wealth and
What's the government fleecing poor?
Oh, the casinos, the lottery.
All of the gambling.
Yeah.
The government allows.
yeah. I've heard that called a stupid tax.
That's stupid.
well, this is voluntary.
It is voluntary.
It is voluntary, that's true.
Yeah, and I think that
It's like you're not
it isn't necessarily a vice, isn't necessarily an evil. I didn't mean to get us on a gambling tangent, but no, that
Just as an example of somebody somebody that's
obsessed with right.
Yeah.
I mean, and my point was, it's easy to identify that covetousness in, the penniless gambler who is ready to mortgage everything, or the celebrities that they make the TV shows about that are just multiplying properties and possessions and that flashing and living just to flash it all off to the world, like, look at what I have now, and it's easy to see in them that they're consumed with it, but
Well, our flesh likes it.
yeah, I mean,
Our flesh is like,
who are those TV shows for?
Yeah, because we want to be like this.
Who are the magazines for? I mean, the lifestyles of the rich and famous. That's all for us, right?
It's amazing. You look at those people and you think, you made that much money off of one job, but it's true that in a year you could be broke because the way you spend that money, it's unbelievable.
Yeah.
You can have, if you're in the stock market, you could be broke in 2 seconds.
That's right.
you talk about gambling.
Right.
Jeff, when you go to verse 11, this almost reminds me of what you just mentioned, that old guy that wins the lottery, and then pretty soon every third cousin's like, hey, we're here to have some of that, just in case you're curious. You got a ton, we just want a little bit.
Find out you have a lot more friends
Is
than
that,
I thought.
when goods increase, they increase who eat them. It's like, well,
That was the exact example that I wrote down. I wrote
oh really?
the second drawback to wealth. I put it: money attracts a circle of would-be dependents. And how you've heard stories about the lottery winners that said that money destroyed. They used to have family and friends, but then they won the lottery and they didn't have it. They lost all of those. Not that they went away. It's all those people turned into consumers,
Change.
and they changed the relationship, and they became
That's terrifying.
just like. And yeah, I think that's part of what Solomon is saying there in verse 11. When the goods increase, so are the number of people who are coming for your goods. And
When we talk about, it's pretty evident here what the third one is. The sleep of a laboring man is sweet, whether it's little or much.
yeah,
But basically, the wicked don't get rest.
yeah,
They never can have the peace of a good night's sleep.
yeah,
They're always tormented in that constant state of torment, or always thinking their brain never shuts off, and they're like, man, either it's what can I do over here and how can I manage that, or it's the other side of it when I'm getting a sale because someone wants what I have on that higher end, and
yeah,
you can kind of feel like, hey, they're whispering and the murmurs, and maybe it's me they're after, and it's interesting that there's no rest involved when you're, and again, it's like what's the old song? It's like that drug money that you make. It's dirty money. You got to spend it. That's why you blow it all. Why? Because you can't keep it. Because it's dirty. It's filthy. It's not right. And what's that prayer that I've heard over the years is like, Lord, don't grant me so much money that I forget who you are. Don't grant me not enough that I'd steal and shame your name. Just
Yeah.
give me my portion. That's
Proverbs.
enough for me.
Yeah. Proverbs 27, I think.
Good song, too.
Is it in a song?
Yeah.
It's a good song. Well, yeah, and the third one, as Chris has already pointed out, money disturbs our peace. It shatters. Well, and what is we got to keep in mind here? His perspective isn't that money itself necessarily does this, right? Verse 10, it's those who love silver, those who are. 1 Timothy 6:9. Right, it's the love of money that is the root of all kinds of evil.
It even mentions in, I guess it's 12, it says, sweet is the sleep of a laborer who obviously isn't rich, but it says whether he eats little or much, it's like...
Right, he may have much.
He might, for a laborer,
Mm-hmm.
it's still not stealing his sleep.
Right.
It's just an interesting context too, because whether it's little or much, and that would infer or would imply, I think, it's implicit that these guys have too much. They got people peeling grapes for them, and they have all this, and they're not going to eat it all, and they're fat and happy, but they still can't. They're not going to self-regulate to go. Maybe I just put the fork down, and maybe I just have my portion. Better is a handful of quietness than multitude in the house of strife. Well, no, they're not doing that because they're bought into that thing because everybody else is doing it. They don't want to be the one guy that gets the finger pointed at him for, why aren't you doing what we're doing? This is why we do it. Yeah, I don't know. Moving on to chapter 6, verse 4. No, I'm kidding.
Okay, well, so again, let's see the balance of the preacher here, because in verses 10 through 12, some people, you might hear what he says here in verses 10 through 12 and think, oh, he's attacking money as an idol, yes, but it's not. We tend to fall into extremes here, right? Where if money can do bad things, then maybe the answer or the prescription is to just avoid money. Just have no money, or take a vow of poverty, or just avoid working because you might make a bunch of money, and then what do? You're in trouble. Is that where Solomon leads us? Well, I think the answer is no, as we go on reading the next set of verses. Because what does he see now in verses 13 through 17? We again see that he tells us, I have seen something under the sun. What is it? Okay, we're going to have to interpret that. But what is the first? What does he describe it that he sees? First of all, a severe evil.
Well, how about this? Not just evil, because I beheld an evil under the sun. I
Yeah.
beheld an evil under the sun.
Yeah.
And that's not good, and that's bad. But severe evil, I mean, that's a
Right.
very direct adjective for, this is like, that's the worst.
Yeah.
Like, it's over the top bad.
Yeah, the word there for severe in the Hebrew is most often translated sickly, in the sense of an illness unto death. So some people would argue that it would be a very legitimate, and I think it is a legitimate translation. There is a deadly evil which I have seen under the sun, and then he goes on to describe it. But how does what he sees here in verse 13, how does it connect then to the previous set of verses?
That's part of what I think a lot of people will say. You have to get in the rat race so that you can provide for your kids, so that you can leave a boom for the next generation, for them to inherit.
Right.
They want to have a better life than you did, right? All
Right.
of these reasons why you give yourself over to labor and earning money and playing that whole game, it's for others. Well, he says that doesn't work.
Right. Yeah.
You die and it's gone, and then he elsewhere says, and then they spend it poorly. So,
Right.
so what's up with that?
Yeah. And if I could zoom ahead to chapter 6, verse 12, he asks two questions there. Who knows what is good for man in life, all the days of his vain life, which he passes like a shadow? The second question is the one I'm thinking of. Who can tell a man what will happen after him under the sun? And he's talking there, and when we get to there, about a man who's laboring for possessions. And just like what we see here in verses 13 through 17 in chapter 5, those possessions, who can say if even your own children are going to enjoy them? You can't even say that. I mean, in Proverbs 13, Solomon does say that it is, that's one of the places where he talks about the parents storing up for their children, storing up something to leave, for an inheritance to leave to them. And God is our Father. He has stored up an inheritance that he's leaving for us. We'll talk about that in a minute. But here, this is an interesting. I think we have to be careful with how we read verse 13, because we could read the second half of it as it sounds like he's talking about riches that are like miserly or penny pinching. Here's riches that are made and they're clung to, like the guy, the man that he's describing here he's a Scrooge that's clinging to his coins. Well, actually, the verb there just means to guard, or to. The idea is that the riches are stored, and they're kept safe from. So the idea is that in light of verse 14, they're meant to be given to his son. They're meant to be provisions for his family. So he is gleaning the field, selling his crop, and buying what he needs, but he's holding back a portion that he guards, right? He keeps it for another. And that
Hoard?
not necessarily. If we took it in a more negative sense, that's the word that we would say is hoarding it. I don't think he necessarily means that.
Did Jesus had, there's a fool under the sun. He says, I have enough riches, tear down all my barns,
make bigger barns,
and build another one to fill it. And he goes, fool, tonight your life will be taken
Right.
from you, which fits right in.
Yeah.
I mean, you do that, and you don't know what's going to happen to it.
The calamity that he describes here is of a man who is working to store up treasure, apparently for his family, for his son, but there's this, and the reason I don't think we should be too negative towards the person that's being described here is he describes it as a severe evil. It's a calamity. It's a calamity that happens that when we're told
to try to give them a good inheritance.
To give them a good inheritance, or
inheritance is a metaphor for salvation.
Right, and it could. Does he necessarily mean here hoarding in a sense of being miserly or being trying to keep what he rightly owes to other people, but he's holding it back? Not necessarily. The evil isn't, and here's the thing: the evil isn't the keeping or the guarding of the money. It's the loss of the money. It's the misfortune of the money being stripped away from him. That's the evil.
It's not something he did.
And it's not necessarily. And the New King James translates the verb there as misfortune, or through misfortune, the noun in verse 14. But those riches perish through misfortune. What does the ESV say?
Lost in bad venture.
Lost in bad venture. Okay, yeah. So the idea is an investment gone bad.
My margin says literally bad business.
Bad business. Yeah.
King James says evil travail.
Evil travail.
So it'd be bad work.
Yeah. Or the idea, and this is debatable, but I think because he's describing a severe evil being the loss of the money, that the misfortune, I like the translation misfortune because I think it lends itself to the understanding that he's trying to do good with the money and through some venture, but it just goes bad. It just, and that's the kind of thing that happens every day. I mean, we talk about stocks, you can talk about people trying to start up a business, and maybe you start up a tree business, you fall out of the tree, and boom, you're done. Career's over. Maybe so, or you're dead. Yeah. Right. So I mean, you can keep.
Or the business is bought out by somebody else.
It's interesting how much you get there as I read forward in verse 15.
Yeah. Let's see. This, and you notice that in verse 16 he repeats the phrase, and this also is a severe evil. Just exactly as he came, so shall he go. And what profit has he who has labored for the wind? All the days he also eats in darkness, and he has much sorrow and sickness and anger. Now this is where...
Is that more translated anger or sorrow, like regret?
Um,
I don't know if that's could even be translated that way because I don't read.
It could be translated wrath, would be another. The man who is now he's seeing the severe evil in this 16 and 17 is somebody who is experiencing what we all experience, which is naked we came into the world and naked we will leave it. We'll come in with nothing and we leave with nothing. There's nothing in our hands. We're not carting off our treasures into the next life, the ones that we created here through our labor. So here in these verses, it is a laboring for the wind. This person that he envisions here, the evil that he sees, is the action of actually trying to accomplish what is impossible. Putting too much stock in this life, in what can actually be accomplished through the labor of this life. In other words, he's asking more of life than this life can actually give, which is an inheritance that lasts. It doesn't last. That's part of the big point that he's making in these sets of chapters here. It's an evil for the man then it's not an evil necessarily for him to want to pass something down to his son, and the evil is the misfortune of that being taken away, and then him realizing, oh yeah, I can't, I have nothing in my hand, but actually that's the way I came into the world, that's the way I'm going to leave the world, that's the way everybody leaves this world. It's a hard lesson, but even worse situation in verses 16 and 17 is the severe evil being that he is not learning a lesson, it would seem, from the loss of his possessions. Why do I say that? Because all his days he eats in darkness, has much sorrow, sickness, and wrath. And what we'll see in verses 18 and 19 is a direct contrast to that man.
Well, clearly he didn't pay the power bill because he's eating in darkness. So he didn't even have.
Okay, yeah, that's one interpretation.
That's the source of his anger.
Yeah, he has no oil for his lamp. He's missing 10 virgins. He's missing 10 virgins. Pay your power bill, dude. Don't eat in darkness. That's ridiculous.
Rain, did you have something you
No, I didn't have anything.
Let's say your power bill, dog. Come on.
It doesn't affect my taste at all, I still taste.
That's true.
Sometimes with some kind of cooking, you might want to turn out the lights.
I don't want to know what it is.
Blow those candles out. Why? Let's just try it. Let's just see.
Maybe it'll be more romantic.
Right.
I need your food tastes better.
I can't see it.
Ow, that was my leg.
Now, the darkness that this man is eating in,
Moral darkness.
yeah, I think so, because, yeah, in Solomon, or the preachers used in this book already darkness as a metaphor for the fool.
Yes, the darkness of
Well, I correlated
Yeah.
darkness with his
Right.
He's sick in his darkness, or dark in his sickness, whatever.
Yeah, morally. In chapter 2, here's an example of this. In chapter 2, verses 13 and 14, Solomon sees that wisdom excels folly as light excels darkness. The wise man's eyes are in his head, and the fool walks in darkness. Yet I myself perceive that the same event happens to them all. So yes, the same events of life happen to all of us, but it's the fool who is in darkness when the goods that he's labored for are stripped away from him. He sits in sorrow and anger and sickness. It's sickness of heart, perhaps, sickness of body. Maybe. I mean, the word sickness could be fatigue, like he is.
Ignorance too.
Ignorance. It could be the ignorance of just of chasing the wind. Solomon says you can't chase the wind. You can't grab the wind.
When the book talks about a wise man, talk about probably wise man sees trouble coming afar off, and he hides
Yeah.
himself. And he says the fool passes on destroyed. So it's almost like the fool is blind to opportunity, to danger. It reminds me of being so self-absorbed. And this whole I'm angry and I'm sorrowful and I'm irritated about things, and eating in darkness, the fool eats in darkness, this reminds me of story where we had a guy that was college, and he wasn't a talented guy. He was just the roommate of the guy that I used to work for, and this guy became a megalithic. He was a PhD, so he didn't really earn anything. PhD, Papa had a dealership, so he inherited his dad's thing. His dad died, and so he got away.
I thought it was piled higher and deeper.
Well, I'm deeper. That too. Anyway, but the bottom line is this guy's name is Rod Livesay. And it's interesting you bring this up because Rod Livesay room at Oregon, at the University of Oregon, was Scott Thomason. And they were thick as thieves. So when he came into his thing, when D. Thomason, he moved the dealership from Lake Oswego to Milwaukee. And then it just grew from there, and holy mackerel, and here we go. And then we got this huge 10 stores, and we're running hard and everything else. So Rod Livesay became his CFO, financial guy. He's a really smart and big guy. I just kissed the ring and all this stuff. So 4 years ago, and this is back in the mid-90s, so Scott gets in trouble with the DMV and the law and a bunch of stuff, so he's got to bring his company up. And he sells it and does whatever he does. Anyway, gets paid, nobody gets paid. Makes a ton of money. 3 years ago, I'm talking to a buddy of mine who still works, who at that time was working in a store up on McLaughlin. And we're talking, and he goes, oh my gosh, I gotta tell you this. He says, you never guess why I stopped walking down the street? And he goes, who was it? He goes, it was Rod Livesay. And I went, really? And of course I said, that expletive? You know, because he was just a complete prick. And just very implied. I said, really? That's crazy. He says, yeah, dude, he had one of those down coats with the duct tape and scraggly and all, and he was gone, like blown. And nobody would help him because he was such an a-hole before. Everybody was just like, you deserve everything you got because you were a complete corn bucket on to everybody. And he's just walking down the street, got a duct tape shoes, and just literally completely blown. That to me is the embodiment of what he's saying there, is that, you know, he had it all, and while he regrets it, he might have been angry, I don't know, but he had it all. I mean, he had millions of dollars, and now zero. It's like you go from hero to zero. And then nobody takes your calls. They'll take your calls when you got juice, but they won't take your calls if you're not that guy anymore. Yeah. Because now you're just like everybody else.
Yeah.
So it's interesting in that structure when I see that. I'm reminded of some people that I know who have done really, really well, and they didn't guard it. And I know people that have guarded it and did really, really well, and they're still fine. The idea is part of that I see is that, like when a guy loses his business misfortune, can you imagine the torment of, man, I had all that money and I had to risk it on that sure thing and I blew it and I got nothing, and they're taking the house and the cars are gone and everything else. So it's that fall from grace, if you will, that I'm not saying that righteous people can't encounter that, because God does what he does to do what he does. You know, just like, that'd be like Job. I mean, we would say, is Job a fool? No, God did what he did, and then God did whatever he did, golden earrings and everything else. But at the end of the day, I've seen that. It's oddly enough, I just thought about that when I'm considering that. I saw that in my own life in that way, where a guy's just on top, like the pinnacle of top, the acme. And now he's just the dust on your feet. And it was sad to see. But at the same time, nobody helped the guy. Because he's just out there doing his own thing and not just completely wrong.
Yeah. Well, here, you know, we've got a there is in verses 16 and 17 the severe evil that is described is the disposition of the heart of the man. So not necessarily his condition. We don't even really know exactly whether his bank account's still full or it's empty, where he's at in this. Is he the guy of misfortune, you know? But the focus in 17 is really on the pursuit of his labors is after the wind, and he is sitting in darkness eating his food, and the condition of his heart is one of sorrow, sickness, and anger. So, and that is connected to the fact that just exactly as he came, so shall he go.
He knows he can't keep it.
He knows he can't keep it. He knows that the things that he labors for are like the wind. They are transient. They are temporary things are slipping through his fingers. And what does that do but drive him to the sorrow, sickness, and anger that is described to us there as the severe evil. And I think that we're meant to see it that way because of how the transition into verse 18 works. The connection in verse 18 to verses 13 and 17 is pretty clear. He sees now for the third time, here is what I have seen, and it is good. The Hebrew reads, it is good and beautiful to eat and drink and to enjoy the good of all his labor. So
It says,
it's
it says here it's toilsome labor, which is very interesting.
what version is that?
I'm sorry, I can leave now, but NIV.
Oh, I like the NIV.
We can still be
Man, I'm
friends.
I can't get up off the couch for a minute. But it says toilsome labor.
Not inspired version.
There you
I
I do it.
can't remember which one.
But, I mean, that's interesting because that's the language of the curse, right? So he's saying, even cursed labor.
Which sentence is that?
In 18, then I realized that it is good and proper for a man to eat and drink and to find satisfaction in his toilsome labor
Okay.
under the sun during the few days of life God has given.
Yes, yeah.
Mine uses toil
Okay.
twice in that.
Toil twice. I
Yeah.
mean, that's interesting, isn't
Doubles
it?
up on it.
Yeah. No, that is that's good. I mean, I think that's both of those translations are.
I mean, that means you can't wait.
He used to be a lifeline on NIV, by the way. I didn't miss that. Oh, that's a good translation.
Oh, I did. Some people don't like it. This was a
Well,
study Bible given to me.
sometimes the NIV is very helpful and clear, and does better than others. So they're all
I think that's
a mixed bag. But yeah, no, that's important. The way the NIV draws that out, the translation of the verb or the noun there, because it is toilsome labor. It is labor it's hard. it's under the curse. It's there. You know, this is still under the sun. This is still.
This is exactly why I got an amplified Bible, because I got a little hard hearing now, so it helps.
I have the new Amplified Bible.
When you open it up and it just burn.
The Bible says Dolby in quotes. But no, it's funny because on a serious note, the Amplified Bible, it'll say toil and it goes, worrisome, hard, whatever. It kind of like helps you out because it's like a first grade Bible. I mean,
Gives you like
toil.
That's
Oh,
thesaurus.
you mean work? Okay.
So, okay, what is good and fitting here?
It's like just reward. That's it's just.
What are the specific things that he identifies as?
And find satisfaction.
Okay, yeah, to eat and drink as the enjoyment of one's labors, riches and wealth, even included in this.
And bottom line is, I would think so for this reason. All the days of his life that God gives him, for this is his heritage. In the margin it says his portion. And
Yeah.
it goes on to say that he's going to do this. He will not unduly. He'll do this because God's also going to do this other thing for him. He'll find joy in what he's doing to perpetuate that. So it's that mindset. Now he's going to enjoy that and find joy in that, and it's fitting for him. That's his portion, and God's going to continue that because he's not the guy that's going to go out and just 7 come 11. Oh crap, that's all gone.
And part of it is also in 20, he says, and he will seldom reflect on the days of his life because he's too busy working, which means, if you reflect on the days of your life and you think about the way my toilsome labor is embedded in that process of greedy people supervising greedy people and squeezing what they can out of me. Yes, I'm getting what I need in the midst of all of that, but if you think too much about that,
Yeah.
It can sour you on putting your hand to the plow in your little corner of the field. It's like, don't think.
Say, for my own translation, verse 26, God keeps him occupied with joy in his heart.
Yes.
Oh, yeah, that's yours. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
I
I was keeping busy with the
Yeah.
joy in
I
his
think
heart.
you kind of start to see, you mentioned how this book is taken as pessimistic,
Mm-hmm.
but you kind of start to see here why it's not.
It's, yeah,
It
right.
really is.
Yeah, it's not.
It's just not.
No, this is a moment of hope.
How to have joy in a world that is cursed.
Yeah, where no, life isn't fair, and the guy that's screaming in the darkness, he understands that, and he can't get past it, but there's a way past it, and it shows that way to understand the true origin of those good things, so you can actually enjoy them while you have them.
Yeah, let's look at verses 18 and 19 real quick and pull out from it the key verb, the key act, the action that is critical to all of this. If you can pick it up, it's repeated a couple. That's I think it's in there.
Well, heritage is
The given
portion, and then enjoy is there.
Yeah, I have in mind the verb give, given, given.
Like Hebrew verbs for 1,000, Jeff.
Hebrew verbs for 1,000. This is the critical point of this moment right here. The difference between the persons described in the previous verses to riches, the way that they approach riches and labor, is not through the lens of them having been given by God. These are gifts. These are things that God has given, and if we understand them, then they aren't what is owed to us. We aren't owed. In other words, my work does not equal riches and wealth and good. God gives those things. They're God-given, and in that sense, they are a mercy. They're a grace to us. They are, the unbeliever is assuming that, and think of the unbeliever, and I'm seeing him as an unbeliever in verses 16 and 17. His labor, he's toiling for the wind, and he's in darkness and bitterness and anger and sickness. Well, why would he be like that? Yeah, he feels like he should have these things.
Why can't I be like Joe?
Why
Why
can't
am I here? Why can't I be like Joe?
why
Joe's
can't
got
I?
it made.
Yeah.
That's ridiculous.
Joe Biden, you're talking about?
Exactly.
And there's the,
Well, I don't want to be like you. Do we have to be like you?
there's the
It's his turn.
It's
He's
Hillary turn for you.
Forgive me, I can't help myself.
No, that's okay.
You're in the right crowd. Don's laughing, so we know it's really funny. Don's
You're
laughing.
gonna say, tell a story about corn pop.
Is that a rapper?
He's talking about some black guy that, you gotta hear it. Look it up on eBay, Joe
Crazy Joe.
Great.
Biden and corn pop.
All right.
Corn cob.
Yeah.
Corn.
Pop.
Corn pop.
We will do that. I look forward to that.
Corn pop.
There's the aspect of that too. The guy that doesn't acknowledge that God has given him everything he has, he's, in his mind, he's made his fortune himself, and if he loses it, he's going to lose it himself. In that case, he's going to
Yeah.
have to regain it
What's that?
himself.
Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
self-made man thing. I'm a self-made man.
That's a heavy
Hey,
burden.
you didn't build that. You know what I mean?
Heavy burden.
You didn't build that.
I thought I did. No, it reminds me of that. I've done this. Me. It's the original sin. I, me, I.
It's like
I
that
built this. I
Nebuchadnezzar.
did this. I did this. I did.
Look at this kingdom that I've built, and God shows
Right.
Yeah,
because
big man, little you.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, these verses are probably the most joyful so far in the book. And he's the most explicit that he's been yet in the book, talking about the enjoyment. He's talked about enjoying the good things, the fruits of our labors before, but here he's twice explicitly connects it to the truth that we can enjoy it if we, because it's a gift, because we recognize it as a gift.
It's got to be a gift because elsewhere in here, he even condemns eating and drinking and laboring all your days under the sun as a vanity.
As a vanity, yeah.
So if that's a vanity, which he says right here is your hope
Right.
in the midst of a system that is,
Yeah.
going to hell, then it can't be because it's just eating and drinking and enjoying your labor.
Right.
Because that is utterly vain. It's the giftedness of it and the grace that's in it.
God
that
keeps
allows
him
to
busy
do
and
it.
enjoy his heart.
Yeah,
God
gives
provides
you
that. He
joy
keeps
in
him.
that.
He gives that to him, and then gives him the fuel to fulfill that joy. So it's
Double
a,
gifted.
It's the double gift.
And there is a double gift here because he's talking about enjoying good in the present, enjoying the fruits of our labor today, but he twice says, for it is his heritage, or it is his lot, or it is his inheritance. It's his portion, which if you're reading this through the lens of the covenant people that this was written to, that's the inheritance is part of the covenant promise, which cannot be taken away. In other words, yeah, and the remembrances of it were built into the law so that they would know not the portion really wasn't in this life. It was in the life to come. In other words, the inheritance of the people of God, even in the Old Testament, was rightly understood to be after the resurrection. The author of Hebrews tells us that's the way Abraham saw his inheritance, his portion, his heritage, because he knew that it was not of this world. He was looking for a city whose builder and founder was God. He was looking for a better country, that is a heavenly, as the author says in chapter Hebrews 11. So here's the nugget here. Yeah, it's a foretaste. That's the thing. That's exactly it. Is why we enjoy the good that we have today? Because it's a gift from God that points us to the future. It's God saying, this is what I have in store for you. This is your inheritance. This is the future. And that's how we enjoy the good of today. It's not owed to us. It's by grace. God gives it. And he can take it away. He took it away from Job. And he doesn't have to answer to us. He doesn't have to tell us why he did it. He never told Job why. He challenged Job. Yeah, you want to question me? Okay, let me ask some questions of you. So God is going to, but then God gives him. He gives him a.
After he forgave the people that gave him advice, right?
Yeah, right.
He had to sacrifice. He interceded.
His whole thing wasn't after he stopped asking why.
Yeah.
He goes, "Who are you, Lord? Who are you?" And then everything in return, who are you? And you're greater than Leviathan and this and that, and all you're great, and all the things he espouses. When he quits the why, and of course his friends are just, they're worthless. But yeah, that's a good
And this perspective of tasting and enjoying the fruits of our toilsome labor and the good that God brings about through it, it lifts our eyes to the future, to our hope that's been promised to us, the one that not even death can take from us. That's what the inheritance is, even to these people at this time. Death cannot steal the promised inheritance that God has given to us. It will be ours. And when the believer has that perspective, I think that's when verse 20 comes into play. For he will not dwell, the Hebrew says much, for he will not dwell much on the days of his life. Now, in other words, we can't help but think about our life. You're going to think about the toil, you're going to think about the hardness, you're going to think about the futility of it, but you just won't dwell on it much. Because why? Because God will keep us busy with the joy of his heart. And what's that joy in this context? What is it? I think it's the inheritance. I think it is the joy of when I taste the good that God gives me today and the grace of it, and it points me forward to the future, and that future inheritance which can't be taken from me, there is where my joy is bound up. That's where my joy resides. It is that future inheritance with God, and it can't be taken away from me. And I taste little bits of it today. And if we have that perspective and that attitude, then we won't get wrapped up in much consideration of the hardships and of the toil that we are burdened with.
Keep your eyes on the prize.
Keep your eyes on the prize, and taste the sweetness of the foretastes that God gives us of it today. Every little one that he gives us, taste it for what it is. Oh, this is my inheritance. Man, I want to remind myself to do that. Taste, enjoying the good that God gives and saying, number one, God gave this. He doesn't owe this to me. He gave this to me. He could have taken it away and I would have nothing to do but cover my mouth and be silent. But he gave it as something to taste today, and as I taste it, what am I tasting but my inheritance, my future? And that will bring joy into our lives and into our days, in the midst of the toil, in the midst of the futility, in a way that it won't be something that we get hung up with much. The New King James uses the word, or he will not dwell unduly on the days of his life. I think there's a recipe here for contentment and joy, the kind of joy that James talks about, even when we fall into trials of various kinds, the kind of hope that Paul talks about in Romans 5, where we have patience and hope and joy in the midst of a life and days of our lives that are difficult. And we could easily, and we often do, dwell on them in a way that brings sorrow, sickness, and anger to us. But here's the good and the beautiful thing, Solomon says. I saw this good thing, this beautiful thing, and it is God's people receiving the good the goods that he does give, to receive them as a gift from him, and as a foretaste of our inheritance. And it changes our life. It changes our life.
That's what Thanksgiving should look like.
Yeah. Gratitude flows from this kind of thinking about life and its hardships, but also its blessings that God even gives to the wicked. Right? Well, we'll end there. Anybody have any other thoughts or questions they want to bring up just now?
I very much enjoyed this.
Good. Yeah, we enjoyed you being here, and we're
Very much.
good.
I know.
Yeah, so Bob and his wife Carrie have been coming to worship past few weeks, right? 3 weeks, 4 weeks. So, yep, happy to have you. Yeah. All right, I'll pray, and you guys are welcome to stay and have coffee or more raviolis, please, if you can. Okay. All right.
Ravioli for a week.
No, it looks that way. Father, Lord, let us enjoy this word of yours to us tonight and tomorrow. We do ask that you would build this into our lives, that it would become even a default perspective that we adopt by your grace and help today, that we would look for the good and to see it as a gift and a grace, and Lord, to taste it as a token of our future inheritance, that even our sin, our losses, and even the death of our earthly bodies cannot strip from us. Lord, let us enjoy it in such a way that our lives are filled more. And all of this is made possible by your Son, Jesus Christ, our Savior. Amen. Amen. Like I said, you guys, if you want to hang out, please do. I'm going to get some more water and coffee.